It's just absolutely mind-boggling the amount of regulations you are confronted with on this continent because of the EU. And very belatedly in the past months, European leaders have started to make work of it. But so far, we haven't seen very convincing results. So it's this constant drive that, yes, mostly comes from the bureaucracy, but don't forget also from interest groups. Washington itself is no stranger to lobby groups that are constantly pushing for this or that legislation. Brussels, the capital of the European Union, is itself the capital of lobby firms as well. So you have all that coming in as well. So it has just grown out of proportion.
This is DCEKG, exploring the intersection of politics and healthcare by diagnosing Washington and prescribing solutions. We take a deep dive into the legislation, regulation, and innovation impacting policymakers, providers, and patients. Now, America's health policy expert, Joe Grogan.
Welcome back to DCEKG, where we have the encore or part 2 of our conversation with Dr. Christiaan. Now, Christiaan, I wanted to give you an opportunity because not everybody would have heard part 1 of this conversation, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself, and then we're going to get right into it.
Very good. Thank you, Joe. So Christiaan Alting von Geusau, I'm a dual Dutch-US citizen, having grown up most of my life in the Netherlands, but also having lived in the US and other parts of Europe. I'm a lawyer by training, and I have practiced law for a good number of years in Amsterdam and Brussels. Then about 22 years ago, moved to Austria, where for 20 years I served in the administration of an international Catholic university here, first as vice president and then as president and rector. And I concluded that great adventure in 2023, and since then have been focusing on running another organization that I had already founded in 2010, which is called the ICLN, which is a worldwide network for education and fellowship of politicians who have a Catholic or otherwise Christian background. We organize conferences and courses and all sorts of other formative experiences. And then finally, I run on the side also an advisory firm on geopolitical and legal affairs, Ambrose Advice. And then, of course, I love to do a lot of writing and speaking. So here we are.
Right. So today we could talk about a lot of different subjects, including another time we're going to want to talk about the activities that the ICLN gets involved in, at least the fellowship among Christian politicians across borders, and some of the issues that you found in that experience that link people from a variety of different cultures as they confront weighty political issues with a moral dimension. But today I wanted to talk about the European Union, a subject which we both agree maybe a lot of Americans don't fully understand or appreciate, and certainly the converse is true as well. There's to travel in the European Union for the recent past is to engage in conversations with people who, in my view, have a distorted view of American politics, have a distorted view of the two political parties, have a distorted view of President Trump specifically. That relationship is obviously very strained between the United States and the EU right now, the United States and NATO. So maybe we could start with why did the EU get formed in the first place, and what is it?
So yes, absolutely. Well, first of all, I'm in a very privileged position because having grown up on both sides of the Atlantic and having spent a lot of time on both sides of the Atlantic, having been able to identify as a European and as an American, I've had the great opportunity to put myself in the skin, so to say, of both. And that has really helped me understand also much more the transatlantic relationship. So as to your first question, why was the EU even formed? And I think this is the most important question to even start understanding what the EU is. the EU was a direct response to the centuries-old conflict between France and Germany. That's the starting point to understand what the EU is today. Because if you look a little bit back into history, there are 3 consecutive European continental wars that had at their root the Franco-German conflict. And those wars were first the Franco-German War of 1870 to 1871, then the First World War, 1914, 1918, and then the Second World War, 1939 to 1945. And each of these 3 wars, once again, had the Franco-German conflict at their core, specifically a region that they had been fighting about all those decades. And that is the region of Alsace-Lorraine, which was and is a region at the time very important for steel and coal. And obviously the steel industry is very much dependent on coal, or was very much dependent on coal. So that geographical part of Europe kept moving between those 2 countries, between those wars. So when the horrors of the Second World War finally were concluded, by the way, thanks in big part to the Americans, when those horrors finally concluded, what you saw is that the few European leaders with character that either had not been killed or had not collaborated, that were left, actually went to sit together, especially the French and the Germans, and said, we have to solve this age-old conflict between our 2 countries. And then finally, a man by the name of Robert Schuman, who was the foreign minister of France after the war, after the Second World War, came with the so-called Schuman Plan. And the Schuman Plan, he developed it over the years after the war, but it was finally actually, so to say, made public, the Schuman Plan, in 1950. And in the Schuman Plan, he basically said the only way we can more or less permanently solve this conflict between France and Germany is to pool sovereignty over those assets, those resources. So over the coal and steel industry. In a sense that, yes, obviously they both remain fully sovereign owners of their part of the coal and steel industry in that region, but we're going to create a supranational organization that is going to install structures and systems that allow those 2 countries to start working together and to start, instead of fighting each other over those vital interests, actually start working together, in a way being forced by that system to be working together on developing those shared interests. So basically, what was done with the Schuman Plan, it took out the reason for the main conflict between these 2 countries, because it had devised a system through which both countries had every interest in working together through this supranational institution, which was called the European Community for Coal and Steel. And that European Community for Coal and Steel had certain institutions. It had a parliamentary assembly, it had a court, it had an executive. So basically you still see that in what is the European Union today. But that's where it started. And the interesting thing is, there wasn't a real big plan of many people. There were not many committees behind that. There were, in fact, a number of visionary men. Robert Schuman was one of them. Konrad Adenauer, who was then the Chancellor of Germany, was another one of them. And those 2 men trusted each other. There was actually a friendship. They actually decided together that in order to avoid an immediate pushback from all the people who were going to give reasons why this was not going to work, they actually coordinated the moment that Robert Schuman, as the French foreign minister, was going to proclaim this Schuman Plan, and Konrad Adenauer, the German chancellor, was more or less a few moments after that, going to make public that Germany would go along with that. Because especially Robert Schuman knew that many within the French establishment would initially not be particularly happy with such a system where resources are being pooled and so to say, the sovereignty over it is being pooled. But he did it and they pulled it off. And that was the starting point for what is today European Union. Later came the European Community for Nuclear Energy, which did the same with nuclear energy. Later came the European Economic Community. And all those three communities, coal and steel, nuclear energy, and the economic community, were then finally in the 90s through, amongst others, the Maastricht Treaty, so to say, merged into what is today the European Union. But basically, and then I'll finish the first part of my answer, basically, the European Union was from the beginning a peace initiative. And by the way, it's important for Americans to understand that the United States, under President Truman at the time, starting 1945, was very much behind such a process of more closer cooperation between European countries. And of course, the Marshall Plan was a very important contributor to this, because the US Marshall Plan, which was the plan through which the United States invested heavily in the rebuilding of Europe, which of course was in the interest of the United States itself, because Europe was then and continues to be its most important trading partner. So the United States was actually very much invested in the success of this development. And another great American statesman who played a major role in this was Dean Acheson, the US State Secretary.
So the origins of the European Union were really centered around peace. That was the goal, peace, recognizing that the conflicts were over natural resources, to clearly a key driver of the previous
natural resources and industry. And industry also. Yeah.
Okay, so I guess the fundamental question is, what went wrong? And in my mind, in my biased view, you alluded to it or left a breadcrumb there when you said there was no big committee that did this. It was a small number of people, visionaries, decent people with personal connections, committed to peace, and frankly, fairness, in that they were able to stage the announcement in order to garner more political support and not one-up one another, and were really focused on the future of their countries and the betterment of the continent as opposed to their own political fortunes. Now, when you look at the EU from an American lens, certainly, you see a vast bureaucracy. You alluded to the nuclear cooperation component that was built upon the coal and steel compact. And since then, the European Union has abandoned nuclear energy for green delusions, in my mind. They've abandoned that enterprise altogether, and they appear not as if there's a collection of great leaders or visionary leaders, but as just a vast bureaucracy. What happened?
Well, maybe rephrase that a little bit, because it's probably a little bit too simplistic to throw it on a big heap like that.
That's one of my specialties.
Right. Well, first of all, maybe one final historical point to get the whole picture. France and Germany were immediately, when they started in 1950 after the Schuman Declaration, were immediately joined in this effort by a number of other countries who are the core founding members. Those were Italy and the Benelux countries. They all joined right from the beginning in starting this process. So there were basically 6 key founding members.
So the Benelux countries are what, for those people?
Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg.
Got it.
So you had the 6 founding members of what is today the EU were Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, with France, Germany, and Italy. And they continue to be, in a way, a driving force within the European Union. Now, coming to your question, what went wrong? Well, first of all, it's interesting to say, you say the EU is a vast bureaucracy. Well, indeed, it is a big bureaucracy. But, for example, we in the Netherlands always make the joke that the bureaucracy of the European Union is still smaller than the bureaucracy of the city of Amsterdam. So you do have to put that into perspective. But yes, there is a large bureaucracy. I think if you ask where it went wrong, and by the way, another item, maybe to be a little bit more precise, the EU as such has not so much abandoned nuclear energy, especially its most important member as to the largest and most important economy, Germany, has under the previous government abandoned nuclear energy, which thankfully they have recently been publicly regretting as one of the most strategic mistakes that they have made. But if you put that against France, France has always been the most important nuclear power on the European continent, both, of course, as a nuclear armed power, but also as the country with a large number of nuclear reactors, so actually producing electricity through nuclear energy. And France has never, ever verged from that course. They have always been a nuclear power in the civil and military sense.
Yep. I'm sorry. That was a bad oversight on my part. I guess I haven't focused on the German thing. You understand from an American perspective how frustrating it is to have Germany walk away from nuclear energy and pursue a energy policy that would lead them to be dependent on Russian gas, and why it's like blindingly stupid decision that you knew was going to lead. And it's, Trump talked about this, and of course he was mocked by many Germans, many including leading politicians, for having the audacity to say that abandoning nuclear energy was a mistake and that getting dependent on Russian gas was a mistake.
Right. The whole reason why nuclear energy, which interestingly, it was under a so-called conservative government from Angela Merkel, that nuclear energy, she was in a coalition with the Greens, and that was the big election promise of the Greens, who were in coalition with her Christian Democratic Party. But it was Angela Merkel under her government. By the way, part of whom at that time was the current president of the European Commission, Mrs. von der Leyen. She was part of the government at that time, the same von der Leyen, Ursula von der Leyen, who's now telling us that it was such a bad mistake. So it's interesting how history comes back full circle. In Germany, the whole abandonment of nuclear energy and this fixation on unrealistic green energy dreams, as you correctly say, was a purely ideological thing. Had nothing to do with science. It was purely ideological. And see in Germany how high the price is if ideology takes over from science, because the German economy is in a very bad shape. It used to be the industrial motor of the European Union. In a certain sense, it still is, but it has lost a lot of its industrial power because energy has become too expensive in Germany. The country is overregulated, and et cetera, et cetera.
Right. Well, they have a history. They do have a history in Germany of ideology triumph over science, but we don't need to revisit that.
Right.
Beyond the nuclear. But you're right. So we went down a little bit of rabbit hole here because you needed to correct my sloppy statement about Europe abandoning nuclear and get us back on track. The French are actually leaders and always have been. But the fundamental question is, what went wrong with the EU?
Well, what went wrong is, I think it's good to use a word for that, and that is the principle of subsidiarity. And let me explain what that means in political terms. In fact, the principle of subsidiarity comes from Catholic social teaching, and the European Union, better to say, the process of European unification has basically adopted that principle in the beginning. Subsidiarity means, in political terms, as it is understood here in Europe, is that things are regulated and decided upon at the level where it is closest to the people being affected. So whatever you can legislate or policy-wise organize on the most local level, the municipal level, that's where it will be. And then provincial and then national member state level, etc. And basically that principle of subsidiarity means that the European Union as a supranational body should stay out as much as possible out of areas, out of competencies that are much better handled on the national, provincial, or local levels. And that is where it has gone wrong. Because as the EU moloch of legislation has been growing and growing, and the apparatus around it has been growing and growing, the European Union has been encroaching on more and more areas of life where it has no business. And this everything under the guise of the single market. You know, there is in the European treaties this important principle that we are there's the thing called the single market, where we try to have one market like the United States has it. You know, the United States has 50 states, but it has one market.
Right.
And it's very easy to cross goods and services and finances, etc., across state borders. That's basically what the European Union also wanted to achieve. But what it started doing is it started increasingly using that in itself sensible idea of the single market, because basically the idea of the single market is based on the principle there should be no trade barriers or indirect trade barriers that make it difficult to cross borders. So that principle in itself is a good one. But if an institution like the EU has been doing starts encroaching on more and more areas under that guise of saying, well, this is also really the single market, that's when things started going wrong. I'll give you one example, a very contentious example. It is very clearly understood between member states in the European Union that matters regarding life and death, you know, like the contentious issues of abortion and euthanasia, are exclusively the purview of the national governments, of the member states. And that's logical, you know? And the European Union has been doing everything in its power to make abortion a EU-wide human right, although it's not within the competency of the European Union to do so. And this is just one of many areas. And
I'll tell you another one. You go in, they've driven smoking out of bars and restaurants. Now we can say, I'm not a smoker, so I'm not a big fan. But why is that a big issue for Brussels?
Right.
You go in, they've demanded the bathrooms all get redone to meet certain standards, which again, I love a nice fresh bathroom, but that's not really in their core competency. Right. They've got this whole thing on the way they want the Italians to sell their beach clubs and allow them to go up to the highest bidder, which is complicated because they say they're a subsidy for locals and they don't get enough economic value out of this coastal real estate, and that the Italians need to put these things up for auction, and on and on and on it goes. Every time you turn over a new stone over there, there's some crazy thing that the EU is getting involved in that is not to do with the free flow of goods between point A and point B. You know, you want to talk about one currency? Great. They got the euro. You want to talk about no tariffs between Italy and Austria? That makes sense. But why are they screwing around in all these local cultural issues and moral issues that don't affect Brussels? Is it just that they can't help themselves because the bureaucracy gets to a certain level and they just keep encroaching with added vehemence? And is there any attempt to rein this in?
I think you have two problems here. One is an ideological one. It is clear that over the decades, the European Union has been more and more used by certain ideological groups to push their agenda through. And obviously, it's much easier to do it on an EU-wide level if you can use the European institutions to forward your specific agenda, then obviously you will try to do so. So it has been very much an ideological movement where the European institutions have been used to advance certain ideological agendas. The other side, and this is a general challenge that every government has, I once heard, I can't remember what the source is, but I've always found it a very interesting one. Somebody I think it must have probably even was Ronald Reagan who said that, who said the only reason why the American government exists is to make sure that the American government continues to exist. Saying with that it's a self-perpetuating mechanism in which it grows and grows because the institution wants to make sure that it stays relevant. And what you see in the European Union is that it has become the champion. And by the way, these are not my words, these are the words of Friedrich Merz, the current Chancellor of Germany. The EU has become a champion in over-regulation. It's just absolutely mind-boggling the amount of regulations you are confronted with as a business in this country, on this continent because of the EU.
Right.
And very belatedly in the past months, European leaders have started to make work of it. But so far, we haven't seen very convincing results. So it's this constant drive that, yes, mostly comes from the bureaucracy, but don't forget also from interest groups. Washington itself is no stranger to lobby groups that are constantly pushing for this or that legislation. Brussels, the capital of the European Union, is itself the capital of lobby firms as well. So you have all that coming in as well. So
right.
it has just grown out of proportion.
So let me give you a couple of statistics here. 30 years ago, the EU's economy, as you know, the economy of the EU was larger than the United States. 1996, the EU's economy was about 8.4 trillion, the United States 8.1. So the beginning of Bill Clinton's second term. 20 years ago, the US was now bigger, 13.8 to 12.8 trillion. 10 years ago, the gap had expanded from that 1 trillion. Now, 10 years ago, we were $5.4 trillion bigger. And now we're about $9 to $10 trillion bigger in nominal terms, roughly 1.4 times the EU's size. You know, I know the UK is not in the EU, but as an example, the per capita GDP in the UK, where I'm currently living, is worse than the state of Mississippi, which for many, many years was the poorest state in the United States. And if you look at comparing particular US states to European economies, it's really stark how certain US states compare with certain members of the European Union. All that regulation has gone to bog their economy down, not just a lack of focus on the part of Brussels as they get involved in all these issues that are not core to the free flow of goods and the common prosperity of all, but they've totally lost their eye, taken their eye off the ball. What were they originally in business for, and what are they doing now? And they seem to be less and less to an outside observer, less and less interested in prosperity and far more interested in cultural issues and economic redistribution.
I think that really what you're saying puts the finger on what is currently the biggest problem in the EU. For some reason, the EU over the years has increasingly felt the need to become some sort of global moral leader in the sense of telling the rest of the world what to do and how to think, etc. And again, this is very much driven by this ideology. And so what you have seen is that all sorts of laws have come, actually, when it comes from the EU, you call them regulations. But all sorts of regulations have come into the system that have tried to regulate into detail. For example, you have the supply chain regulation. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but that's a regulation through which European firms have to prove that the whole of their supply chain is ethical. And now, again, in itself, the intention is a good one, because obviously we do not want slave labor to be making our goods. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But the question is, should this be regulated by the European Union in a way that puts huge burdens on companies, or should other more feasible political ways be found to actually tackle that issue at the root, instead of basically forcing companies to prove that the supply chains they use are in fact ethical?
Do they force Chinese companies or extraterritorial companies to certify that as well? I mean, certainly it can't be easy.
So basically, companies that are in Europe, that are, so to say, founded in Europe or that have operations in Europe, are in a way obliged to do that. I don't know the exact details how it counts for a company that is fully operating outside of the European Union, but my presumption is that that is not the case, because then we could hardly import any products from China, because especially in a country like China, there is so much slave labor involved, or at least conditions, work conditions that are not up to standard, what we deem to be correct and dignified. So it's mostly the EU companies themselves that carry the brunt.
Okay, so in this context, we're currently dealing with a situation where we have second term of Trump's presidency. He's been pretty tough on NATO. He was tough in the first term. He's been hammering on things, and members of his administration have been hammering on free speech issues, which perhaps is another one of the subjects that the EU has been getting involved in, regulating social media, branding certain things as hate speech that Americans would find distasteful because of our reverence for the First Amendment and free speech. Where do you see things now? You spend a lot of time all over the continent. You travel back and forth to the United States as well. The United States continue to open this gap in the size of our economies. You've got the Russia-Ukraine war still going on. What do you think about the U.S.-EU relationship right now?
Well, the EU-US relationship obviously is in big trouble. And we can see that, especially if you compare it between the first Trump term and the current second Trump term, there is a big difference. It's interesting because you mentioned free speech. In fact, free speech plays a big role in this continuing growing misunderstanding between the EU and the US. Because indeed, in the US, we have the First Amendment. And the First Amendment is something that plays a very big and central role in the way society is run. In Europe, there is no such thing as a First Amendment. Of course, there are human rights treaties and, of course, the national constitutions that in more or less form, of course, protect free speech, but not in the way that the First Amendment does that. And we see that, amongst others, in the European Union by the infamous Digital Services Act, which under the guise and well-meant intentions, again, of protecting people online and avoiding hatred, it of course sweeps a lot with it and has the danger of turning into a censorship system. And we already see some examples of it. There's now a big case going on between Twitter, or X it's called now, and the European Union in front of the European courts. And there's a great danger that this Digital Services Act can and will be misused, not only by the European Union, but also by national member states to limit free speech. But that's just an example. What I see in the transatlantic relationship, and what is my biggest worry, is that there is a fundamental incapability to communicate with each other on an understandable wavelength. That has to do with the fact that, on the one hand, the President of the United States goes beyond any diplomatic, how can you say it? Beyond any diplomatic expectations or traditions or whatever you want to call it. And he speaks in a way that is at times outrageous and at times very insulting for people. So Europeans are not used to that and tend to take it either personal or, to make a big, how can I say, moral issue out of it. And so what you see is that those two things are currently colliding. And there's a real distrust now, on the one hand, from the United States towards the European Union, because currently the people running the administration in the United States have a deep distrust of the European institutions, and they also express that. And from the side of the European Union, or let's say that when I speak about the European Union, I speak about the institution, but of course you also have the individual member states. And from the side of the European Union and the European nation states, there is this now newly found mistrust in not so much the United States as in the current administration, which of course centers mostly around the question, can we depend on the United States when push comes to shove and we are really in great difficulty? And where it lacks from both sides, in my view, is that too little effort is being made to continue the conversation. Because if every time, for example, the president says something outrageous again, you can, make a huge issue out of it, or you can accept the fact that this is the way this president operates, whether you like it or not, and continue engaging with the United States in the best possible way. The other way around is the same. If you see that the current administration has its difficulties with the European Union and its institutions, that doesn't mean that it shouldn't continue the conversation and seek ways of solving the growing number of issues that are currently driving this wedge between the two continents. Because I'm of the opinion that the United States needs Europe as much as Europe needs the United States. And we have to overcome our differences, and we have to also, unfortunately, have to deal with each other's imperfections and try to find ways to cross the divide. I have no other solution for that. But
fair, but okay, well, let me not to play devil's advocate, but I just want to 1 degree off, or maybe a couple degrees off from that. And I totally believe in the dialogue idea, and we have to keep talking to one another. I do think that the cultural difference, though, is a key part of this. The fact that the EU, as a bureaucratic superstructure, is wading into cultural issues that many Americans find to be, and in a way that many Americans find to be offensive. And the vast majority of members of the Trump administration, if not every single one, would find to be offensive on speech, on a whole host of things. I think, too, some of the rhetoric towards Trump hasn't been that decorous either on the European side. And if you think about the nuclear energy thing in Germany and a lot of the green energy stuff, it's just so objectively stupid. Right. Now, the Europeans may point to certain things that the Americans do and say, okay, this is dumb, that's dumb. But the fundamental question of, can the EU depend upon the United States when push comes to shove? I guess the question is, why should they expect to have the United States, and why are they not viewing the first line of defense as themselves, each other? Whether you're looking at the problems with Russia, Ukraine, or the amount they spend on defense. Remember, Trump said you've got to spend at least 2%, which is the NATO commitment that they were all ignoring. He was blown off at first. Now they're at least talking about it. But from an alternative point of view, let me throw this out to you. I think the European Union right now is not set up to do the right thing or defend itself. And so the question of, can the United States depend on, or can the EU depend upon the United States? The United States doesn't think it can depend upon the EU, number one. And number two, the EU is so like comically dysfunctional that they're screwing around in all these issues and not focused on what's really important. So how can you have a dialogue with that? I mean, what should the United States be doing? Going to the EU and saying, you got to stay out of cultural issues and get back to brass tacks, or how should this proceed? Because I think it's apples and oranges until you get another left-wing American administration that is totally aligned on these cultural issues and views an international superstate as a wonderful thing in order to drive cultural and environmental changes.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is a great question that needs some unpacking. First of all, there is no doubt about the fact that Europe has been free riding much too long on the United States where it comes to defense and defending the own content. That is an absolute disgrace. That has no other words than that. It's an absolute disgrace that for decades Europe has basically thought, oh, we don't really need to care much about our own defense because when push comes to shove, the United States will fix it for us. So President Trump has been absolutely right in pushing the Europeans to come to a decent way of defense spending. And most reasonable European leaders also see that. So that was an absolutely essential thing to do. Now, coming back to the cultural issues, I fully agree with you, and that's what I also said earlier on. I fully agree with you that that's exactly the area where the European Union should stay out of. All these cultural battles, these cultural issues, as we call them. That's something the European Union should stay out of. But as I explained earlier, the problem is ideologies that have nothing to do with the initial peace initiative that the European Union was. Actually, the European Union at its beginnings from the Schuman Declaration was an initiative for peace and prosperity. And of course, all these cultural warfare issues have nothing to do with that. But that's just because EU institutions have, unfortunately, for a large part, been captured by these ideologies. So I fully agree with you that that is a problem. However, we should also not overrate it. I can see that, for example, in my own country, the Netherlands, that is known as the most progressive country, and on all these cultural issues, it's, so to say, on the progressive side. But in daily life, in a country as the Netherlands, yes, you do see some signs of it, obviously. But it's not as if that's the whole thing that society is about. So I also think that from the vantage point of the United States, that issue is at times seen looming larger and bigger than it in effect, if in fact giving it at times too much credit as an issue. Yes, it is an issue. It is a serious and problematic issue, but it's not as if that's the only thing that is happening. So I think it's good to also put that into perspective.
Well, but if the people in the Netherlands are ignoring the admonitions from Brussels, should the United States be dealing directly with the Netherlands, directly with Italy, directly with Germany, and not engaging with the EU? Because the EU seems to be out of touch with based upon what you just said, that even in a very progressive country like the Netherlands, if they're being ignored, then what's the solution for engaging in Europe? Is it ignoring the EU and focusing on the national capitals, which look increasingly like, I don't want to overstate it, I was going to say colonies, but you'd be irritated by that sloppy. But that the national leaders are frequently de-emphasized and don't have as much power as say they did 40 years ago.
It's interesting to see that vantage point from Washington, because in fact, the national powers, so to say, that the member states do have the final word in everything that comes out of the EU. And that's something not to forget. I'll give you an example. The EU on all important matters meets the Council of Ministers, which is basically the national ministers of all the member countries. And it's their decisions, and also at European summits, it's their decisions that finally have to sway. And there's a whole range of issues where unanimity is required. You saw that, for example, with the infamous EU loan to the Ukraine, where, amongst others, Hungary was blocking it with a veto. Now it unblocked it yesterday. But that was because unanimous voting of all the government leaders is required for that to happen.
Yeah, but don't they withhold money to Hungary in order to coerce them into releasing that money to Ukraine?
Oh yes, absolutely. But that money is money that comes out of a fund that is created by the European Commission itself, by the executive branch itself.
Well, fair enough. But when you create that fund, you don't necessarily know immediately that you're going to get blackmailed down the road for a loan to another country, right? I mean, did Hungary know when they voted for it? Did Italy know when they voted for the creation of that fund that eventually it was going to come whipping around and say, the EU was going to say, we want to loan money to Ukraine. You're not going to get money out of this unrelated fund unless you do what we want you to do. So it doesn't really seem like the national governments are fully autonomous when they're being, what's your analogy? Bribed, blackmail, coerced into voting the way Brussels wants them to vote.
Right. Well, first of all, the Brussels or the European Commission would see that differently, because they claim that they have not sent that money because of rule of law and democracy issues that they have with Hungary. It's interesting.
But you know the truth. You know the truth.
No, I know. And it's interesting because that has always been the argument. But now that the ruling party in Hungary has lost, and a new party is in town, suddenly that issue seems to have evaporated. Right. Although we don't know the new party yet. So yes, that has to be taken with a grain of salt. And obviously, although it will never be admitted, such funds can be used and will be used as a pressure mechanism. But what I'm trying to say is something else. And that is, we should be careful not to overstate the power of the European Union. It remains a supranational organization that is not a super state. I mean, its executive branch would love to be a super state. The European Commission would love it to be a super state, but it is not, because at the end of the day, for all important decisions that affect the whole of the European Union, it still needs, in all important cases, a unanimous vote, and in other, a qualified majority. So, but I'm still haven't answered the other question you had, and that is, who should the United States talk to? Well, I think it's already happening. I don't really need to answer that question because it's already happening. You already see that European member states are now increasingly starting to deal individually with the US administration, and the US administration is answering that. European member states continue to engage on a bilateral level with the US administration. Again, if I take the example of my own country, the Netherlands, our king and queen visited the White House last week. Our king and queen even were guests of the president at the White House. And of course, they traveled with a whole delegation, a whole business delegation. And so that is already happening. And interestingly enough, that has also never stopped happening also under previous administrations. The difference now is that since also the Europeans amongst themselves are more split on how to deal with the United States, you do see an increase in those bilateral contacts being developed. From the side of the United States, that is, as I said, already being answered by the current administration, engaging bilaterally with EU member states. But I think it would be unwise for the administration not to continue dealing with the EU as an institution as well, because it's a reality that is there. Whether you like it or not, it's a reality that is there. And the European Union is a supranational body that does have power and that does have influence. And so also the United States has to deal with it. As much as I am constantly calling upon European politicians, I started doing that right after President Trump was elected, that no matter what they think of the new president and his administration, they have to increase their engagement with this administration. Because the new sheriff in town is the new sheriff in town, whether you like him or not. And I have to admit it here, I am an Atlanticist, I
Guilty.
do believe...
J'accuse.
Yeah, I believe in the transatlantic relationship. And so I think we need to work on it.
No, it's good that you get that out. And I know we're running short on time, but I said something earlier and I want you to have the opportunity to counter it, which is the EU can't be counted on to do the right thing. And I'll give you an example or two observations. If you think about the Reagan administration, which is the dawn of my political awareness, and the fact that he had all these protests in Europe about deploying nuclear missiles and a lot of people saying, get the U.S. bases out, and these huge of Europe and all, cut a deal with the Soviets. They thought it was nuts. A lot of people, when he gave the speech in Berlin saying, tear down this wall and all this stuff, although plenty of Germans were ecstatic, of course. There were some great leaders, Helmut Kohl among them. Even if you disagree with Mitterrand, Maggie Thatcher, you had, and even in smaller countries, you just had great leaders, giants that will go down as tremendous leaders. You look across the continent now, you don't see great leaders, number one. So there's something going on either economically or as a function of the European Union that great leaders are not being elevated to really sway things. Orban certainly dominated for a country of that size. He dominated so much of the debate. Maybe that's one of the reasons why he engendered so much vitriol, because he resisted a lot of the cultural pressures from Brussels. But one, you don't have great leaders in Europe right now, and two, we're right now in the United States, we're having a big debate around drug prices, and President Trump wants the Europeans to pay more for drugs and America to pay less. And the more I look at this and what's going on, the more I think it's not going to happen. Why? Because the Europeans are going to do big deals with the Chinese. Every day I pick up the Financial Times or the London Times and the other paper. There are stories about how the European Union is desperate for Chinese investment. There was an article 2 days ago about Bosch, a shuttered, mothballed plant in Spain, that the Spanish government was begging the Chinese to come in with modern Chinese manufacturing techniques to restart it to try and employ the Spaniards. VW is talking about importing more electric cars manufactured in China under their banner. I mean, on and on and on it goes, of the European Union looking to the Chinese to bail them out of the economic mess that they've gotten themselves into. And when you look at this, you think about the fact that they became too dependent on Russia. Before that, there was a lot of sympathy to the Soviet Union. And frankly, they pursued a bunch of dumb economic policies that emboldened Putin. And now we're in this conflict in Iran. The Europeans are almost universally pressing back on it and resisting and not helping as much as President Trump would like. My thesis is that the European Union cannot be relied upon. The United States, if it's banking on the European Union to act not only just in the world's best interest, but in its own best interest, don't count on it. Because I'm watching them crawl into bed with the Chinese.
Well, a lot to say to this. First of all, I think we should be careful not to equate the United States as a country with the EU, because the EU is not a country. It's not a nation. It's a supranational institution. That means
apples and oranges.
Apples and oranges. Exactly.
Okay.
Second thing, the EU does not have a serious foreign policy, and it doesn't have its own defense capability. It was never devised to have that. The European Union is trying to do that with their special representative for foreign affairs, but she doesn't have any power. She doesn't have any power. Why is that? Because none of the European member states will ever be willing to delegate foreign policy and defense policy to the European Union. In fact, anything defense related is anyway in NATO, but the European Union does not play that role. It tries to play that role, but none of the member states wants that. So if you're speaking about, some of the great leaders of the past, they were not EU leaders. They were national leaders, and they will not strong leaders because of the EU, but despite the EU.
So where are they now? Where's the Adenauer? Where's the Helmut Kohl? Where's the Mitterrand? Where's the great leader on the continent now?
And that is a real crisis. That is a real crisis that we have. I would dare say throughout the West we have that crisis. We lack inspirational, or better to say, real visionary leaders of integrity that also dare to look, so to say, beyond the next election cycle to what is good for the country, who have the courage to stand up against stupid ideologies, of which we have seen many. We just heard the example of what has happened to Germany, by the way, where even now the German Minister of Industry is saying, we're having a pipe dream with this, with what we think we want to do with this green energy. So they're coming themselves to these conclusions. But yes, we are lacking in Europe, the sort of leaders that are needed to make that change. But that's a problem of the individual member states, because the EU itself, I cannot say that often enough, not being a country, was never designed also to bring forth great leaders.
But fine. So you can say it's a non sequitur.
It's a bureaucratic institution.
Yeah, but so if my accusation, my condemnation about the lack of, or we have an agreement on this, lack of great European leaders right now. If you say that's a non sequitur, fine. But the fact of the matter is, you don't have European leaders standing up to the EU, with the exception of Orban, who just lost, saying you have to get off our back because our economies are slipping behind. And rather than do that, they're crawling into bed with the Chinese, and they're whining about President Trump. I mean, I don't get it.
Right. I understand your point. Two things on that. I'll come to speak about China. I don't agree with you that European leaders are not standing up to the EU, because that's what Friedrich Merz, for example, did. I don't know if it was in Davos or in Munich, at the Munich Security Conference, that he did stand up against the EU and said the EU has to stop being the overregulator it is, and basically making it hard for innovation to happen. And Meloni has done the same. So we do see increasingly in Europe leaders standing up against the overregulation, and there where the European Union is getting involved where it shouldn't get involved. Now, as to China, I do indeed see that as a serious risk. And by the way, as we were talking about Hungary, unfortunately, Hungary is one of the countries that, maybe unbeknown to many, has unfortunately built quite a strong dependency on China. It has done that apparently to hedge its bets, so to say, in the sense that, if it falls into too much trouble with the European Union, at least, it has China. But of course, that is a very risky and very problematic strategy, that has been developed. But yes, that is a very serious problem that we see, because what nobody seems to understand or be willing to see, that China is not only not a democratic country, it is a country that is a dictatorship. And therefore, you cannot expect in your trade relationship with China to have a situation where you can deal with them according to the principles to which we try to deal with each other in Western countries. So yes, I share with you that concern. Obviously, China is now the second biggest economy in the world. So some way of accommodation has to be found for the sake of peace, obviously, to work with the Chinese. But I'm afraid that many European countries are doing that in a way that is too uncritical and in which they're becoming too dependent. So diversification would be a wise thing to do.
Right. Well, this is a great discussion, Doctor. I really appreciate you coming on.
Well, there's quite a lot to say about this, and I think one could continue a long time trying to unpack the many intrinsic details that are relevant here. But
right.
Thank you.
Well, maybe next time we can talk about the Middle East, which is another subject I know you care deeply about.
Absolutely.
Thank you again for joining. I want to thank our producer, John C.Z. Swartacki, our sponsor, Survivors for Solutions, and all our listeners. Thanks for tuning in to DCEKG.
For more conversations that get to the heart of healthcare policy, follow us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. DCEKG is executive produced by John C.Z. Swartacki and sponsored by Survivors for Solutions, a Stay on Course Studios production.